Hi everyone, my name is Hayden and I'm presenting a lecture on components and reusability that has been prepared by Fahad from Canva. And this lecture really is about taking you away from this kind of single React app file that you have. So far, React apps as you understand them are just all contained within one single file. You might be importing CSS or an image, but your actual code and JSX is still contained in one place. And that's perfectly fine if you're building very simple apps, but one of the problems is the second you get into more complicated apps, and in particular, apps where you're reusing the same kinds of components. Maybe you have the same type of button that you're using over and over again, or maybe you have the same style of paragraphs, or you have a particular paragraph with a function in it that formats some text. Like once this reusability comes into play, we need to start thinking, how do we in the React world create these little atomic components that we can reuse as many times as we want? Now you're all quite familiar with principles of don't reinvent the wheel, right? We don't like repeated code. We don't like doing things again from scratch when we don't have to. It makes the code not only more readable, but it makes it easier to test and easier to debug because everything has its right place and it's not all spaghetti. Components, though, in terms of React, are they form part of this broader idea called component-driven development, which is really just the formal words to describe what we're talking about today, which is that rather than kind of build a web page with this whole just lots and lots of JavaScript everywhere and files, you actually say, okay, well, I have a page that's made up of 3 components, and each of those components are made up of smaller components. Maybe I have my header, which is made up of a nav bar and a title, and then my nav bar is made up of menu options, etc., and you can break your page down like that. Now this works very, very well within React components, and essentially it's just, instead of taking a whole page with all these tags, is that we can actually group them and separate them out. Now, in terms of React, I think what's important is don't think about this as taking out HTML and putting HTML into separate components, like ripping it out into little pieces. Because remember that in React, everything you're writing, it's JavaScript flavored with HTML. It's not HTML flavored with JavaScript. So you actually probably already understand everything I'm going to talk about today, which is just like a normal program. If you wrote your entire program in a main function and there was lots of repeated code, you learn in the very first days of programming the importance of functions and separating that out, and taking this big giant main function and turning it into a series of little reusable functions. And that's really what we're doing here. It just happens to be that these functions, unlike maybe some other types of programming, they're not just logic, they're actually visual elements, but the same principles apply. So let's create an example with a very simple component, and in React, in modern React, a component is really just a function that returns some JSX, like some HTML. So I could copy this, it's so small. And we've got ourselves a function or component here. Again, component meaning function that returns JSX, that just happens to return a button with the text hello inside of it. And if I save that file, it's like we have now made a component. That's it. This is a simple React app. I've just stripped out some of the things that are create React app ads, and we've just now made another component. And these are like 2 separate visual elements, but the thing about React is that by default, the current setup will always render the app function as like the main function to actually exist on the page. And we can dig a bit deeper now, and you can actually see that here inside of our index.js, which is the main file that React loads to run. You can see that it's actually loading that app component that we've been writing in app.js as what to put on the page. And all we're trying to do now is create more of these. So you can see that our app function that is provided to us, which displays all of this, for instance, this is the React app as it is now. It's just a hello piece of text. That is rendered simply by importing that main component and then putting it as if it's JSX, treating it like it's an HTML tag. It's not an HTML tag, it's a JSX tag, but it's treated pretty similarly, right? We just output app, we write app as a component. So in a similar way, if I have my button component here, in this case I don't need to import it, I can just add this under here like this, button. Now, most components that you write will probably, they'll be void tags, they won't have inner HTML, and that's okay for now. You don't need to worry about that too much at this moment. But yeah, if I save this, you can see that this is how React builds a page. It's essentially saying that this page is the app component, again, function that returns JSX. And all this does is it has a div with children of some text and the button component itself. And then React is able to go and get that button function component and then inject what's here into that page. And again, if you look at the dev tools for this, you can see that this is exactly what it does. It just kind of builds a page in a series of components. So what's outputted is still fundamentally just a single HTML page with the JavaScript embedded, but you're able to, in source code, build these pages in very modular ways. Now, why is this exciting? This isn't too exciting by itself, but what is exciting is when we can make a few of these. So if I just copy and paste this now, we can easily add 3 buttons to our page. And you know what? This is very handy because now if I want to add a certain style to these buttons, such as a width of 100 pixels, I now only have to do it in one place, and I'm not repeating myself. So this is where, just again, that simple concept of don't repeat yourself, abstract similar code into functions comes into play so heavily here with components. Now, in many React projects, what you'll often find is that a common pattern will be that someone will make a folder inside of the source folder called components, and they will take their new components, functions that return JSX. They will make a new file called button.js. Follow the same pattern as what you've done, button.js. They'll save it in here. And now we've got our button.js, which is this function, and voila, there's your function. Now I just have to change the syntax highlighting here, and then what they do is they'll import it, just like how in import.js we imported app from app in the same folder. So inside of my app here, I'm just going to import button from the button file. Now you notice one problem with this is that this button component is not in the same folder as my app.js. It's actually inside the components folder. So to import that, I need to import it component/button. You don't include the .js when you're importing other React components. I believe that you can. I believe, yeah, there's some other errors here. This has successfully imported it now. It's just giving us other errors. But you'll see if I include the .js, it works fine. It's just not necessary. It helps keep the syntax a bit cleaner. So why is this not working? Well, this is because inside of our components button.js, you can see that React must be in scope. And this is a kind of React 101 thing. If you're ever doing anything with React, i.e. writing JSX, you need to include the import React up the top of the file like this. That's just required. Now this will mostly work, but now we run into kind of one of the last problems here, which is to do with exporting. Now, because components is the first time in React that we deal with kind of multi-files in a structured way, I think it's an appropriate time to talk about importing and exporting. Importing is the process of taking components or objects from another file and pulling them into yours, and exporting is the process of actually saying to someone who's importing you, what am I giving you? And in this file, you can see we're not actually exporting anything. So let's go back and have a look at app.js. You can see here that at the bottom of app.js, we are doing this thing called export default app. Now, this should half make sense. Export, sure. App, that's our component function that returns JSX. Okay, let's try and copy and paste that here. Except instead of app, we'll use button, because that's the name of our component here. Okay, now this somehow starts to work. So I do like to think that the importing patterns here kind of make sense. There's 2 main types of imports. There's generally library imports like this one, where you're not importing a file that you made, you're importing an actual dependency or module that you've installed. This module here hasn't been installed, as you can see, React. It's been installed as part of our npm repository that was created when we created the React app. Whereas these things here are just like local files, and they've got these relative imports. Now, from this, you can kind of make sense how these imports work, right? You want to import the want to import React from the React module. You want to import logo from logo.svg, and export kind of makes sense. The one key thing about export to get your head around is the difference between default and non-default exports. So I'll just kind of show you the difference. If I just export button, that's totally fine. This is not invalid syntax, but the way you import it now has to be different. Because when you say export default, what you're really saying is that this button is all that's exported from the file. Like, this file is button. That's all it is. Whereas when you say export button without the default, you're saying that one of the things that I'm exporting out of this file is a button. And the way you import that then becomes a bit different too. So for instance here, I now have to import button like this. Now, yes, oh no, this is annoying. Export function button. Let's get this working. This is a little bit strange. I might actually just rewrite this function syntax a bit differently here, just so it's like the more modern style, and this will also help us do the export. We'll just do it like this. So the thing about the export here is we are not doing the default export, and that means that to import it you use the brackets. Now what are these brackets? These brackets aren't really anything super complicated. It's standard destructuring. So if you kind of Google like destructuring, you will see that destructuring in JavaScript, it's like if you have an object, these are all list examples, but I'm sure there's, yeah, so if you have an object like, yeah, so if you have an object like this one here, where you create like something with two elements, ID and is verified, then you can extract those elements from the object directly like this. So normally what would happen is if you wanted to say like, if you wanted to get those two elements, you'd have to say const ID equals user.id and const is verified equals user.isVerified. Destructuring, just as a reminder, is the shortcut to do that, which is kind of saying, you know what, can you just get the properties ID and is verified from user? I'd just like you to do that. And we're doing the exact same thing here when it comes to importing. So by saying import button, like a destructured object from components, you're kind of implying the button is just a property of what's exported. So we might have other things here, such as, you know, we'll have button and paragraph, right? So let's include a paragraph. So now I'm going to make a paragraph component, which is just going to return p, hello, like this. And you can see now I'm exporting two things, and both of these exports are forming kind of an object of what's given when someone imports this button file. So that's how I would import both of those, and now for instance I could use a paragraph component because I've imported it. Default exports though only allow you to export one thing. So if I was to say export default, sorry, usually you put usually you put default exports at the bottom. So if I was to say export default button like this, and you know, drop these exports, then this now is imported in a totally different way. I have to import it like this. So remember, if it's a default export, if it's a default export, you are only exporting one thing, and you import it like this without the destructuring, because whatever you import, it's just the thing. It's not like one of the properties, it's just the thing. Whereas if you're trying to export multiple things from one file, then you tend to do things like this, where you don't have the default and you just have export this thing and export that thing, and then when you import it, you're importing it like this. Now, which is the best approach? Well, it depends on what you're doing. Generally with components, generally the kind of strict style is that you do one component per file, and that component is default exported. So you would probably do a programming pattern most like this. You would have a button component, which would be default exported. And then you would have a paragraph component as well. So I would here create like a paragraph.js, and then I would create this, and then I would export default paragraph like that. And I would have to include the React line as well. That's kind of the generally accepted way that you would do these things as cleanly as possible. So now I've got these two components. And I can't write paragraph. Now we've got a page with many components, all separated, nice and spread out. We're importing them, we're exporting the component. Remember, the component is just a function, which here we're using kind of first class syntax to work for us, and it's just returning JSX. So very, very simple stuff. We've gone through this kind of button example, but kind of an obvious question that you might have been thinking about if you were thinking about this is all well and good, but like a lot of my buttons aren't going to have the same text. Like, what's the point of reusing a button if it's got the exact same stuff? This really comes to this question here, which is like, how do I control the state and the user interface of my component? How do we make dynamic components? Well, it's very similar to functions, right? If you write a function that doesn't have any parameters, then in general it's going to be a function that is stateless. It's like non-dynamic, right? It just does something and it's fixed in time. Whereas if you pass parameters to it, then you can make decisions. And we can actually do a very similar thing here with what we call props, which is kind of the second key part of this lecture. And props is this idea where you can customize components when they're created with different parameters. And we call these props for properties. So for example, with our button React component that we made, we can control its event handlers, background colors, and text. So I'll show you one of the simplest things you can do. You can change the text here by, instead of literally writing in the string hello, you could call it title for button. And how do you actually, well actually I should call it here props.title. Props. So with React components, you don't have a series of parameters, you have one. And that parameter is called, well, it's called anything, but like we tend to call it props. And that's saying these are all the properties that are passed into this component. And in this case, I'd like the title property to be what's displayed here. And if I go back to my React app and I hit save, well, the title property is undefined because we haven't actually passed it into our button components. So that's why it displays nothing. Well, how do we pass it into our button components? Well, what's really cool about the props and components behavior is that it actually has a similar semantic to HTML. So you know how in HTML we use attributes to give our HTML tags, you know, parameters. We do the same thing with React, where our JSX elements take in attributes which get passed through to the component as properties. So if I write title equals cat here and dog here and fish here, then when I refresh that page, these HTML properties are what's actually passed in as props. And if you want to get a more clear understanding, let's actually console log this. So if I console log this, you'll see that what's passed into each three of these buttons is an object with one property called title. You can also see I can just add as many attributes as I want here. I could also say, you know what, I want I want the background to be red, and I want the background here to be blue, and the background here to be orange. And you can see those actual what is passed in as props in the component changes here, right? We've got our title and our background passed in. Are we using them all? No, we're not. It's just because we're not using them, but we could if we want to. So for here, let me just how do I word wrap? Yeah. So here, I might actually bring this down on the next line. Yep. Let's say we actually want to give a background based on that property value. So here I could say background should actually be props.background. And that is passed through like that. It's really that simple. And then the last thing we can do, which it really gets, well, there's many more things you can do, but one of the last basic things to do is actually pass a function in through props. So now with this button, I actually want it to have a certain behavior. I might actually just clean this React file up. So as your props get bigger, you'll tend to start following patterns like this, where it'll be like your button and then its children are indented, and each property or attribute here tends to get its own line. And with CSS, you might even then indent that further, like that. So let's actually give it an on-click, right? We know what on-click does. If you give it an on-click thing, then like I can define a function up here saying myAlert, which is a function that simply says whoops when you click it. So you, like when this function's called, it creates an alert. So if I just pass that alert function into the button's on-click, then what will happen now is that on this page, when I click cat, it will say whoops, and when I click dog, it will say whoops, etc. But what if I want like a more custom on-click property? You know, I want to generalize what clicking this button actually means. Well, I might pass in a property called click, and that itself is a function. So now if I go back to my component app that's using these smaller components, I will have a click property. And what might I add into here? Well, I might give it alert 1. And I might give it here alert 2. And then here I might give it log 1. And these can all be functions that I define up here, because remember, this is all just JavaScript. It's not HTML, it's just JavaScript. I can make as many functions as I want in this file. What's actually going to be given to someone when I export it is what I tell it to. So I could make more functions here like alert 1 and alert 2. These functions don't matter. They're not going to affect how this file is used by others, because the only thing other people interact with is what's exported. So now I do alert, hey friend, and here I'll say alert, hey super friend, and then what would this one, log 1, and in this case I'll just console log something, goodbye. And they're 3 separate functions that trigger an action, and you see when I click cat, I get an alert, hey friend. When I click dog, I get an alert, hey super friend. And when I click fish, I start getting goodbye printed to the console. And you can pass lots of things through these. A very common thing that you will pass through is typically a use state hook. So you actually pass the setter into a component so that like you define your state maybe up here in your app, but then you actually give the ability to modify that state to a component. And that component takes that function and it can call it, which will update the broader state, the broader apps state. And obviously this is very verbose, this language here. You can write functions shorthand by, you know, instead of saying alert 1 here, we could say, you know, const alert 1 equals this. And this is just shorthand for this, which is just shorthand for the anonymous function that, you know, so we could obviously make these even simpler. I'm just keeping these short and sweet, so that you get the point without like overthinking the syntax, because this syntax can be very confusing to newer people. But very, very straightforward and clean. So this still works. Cat, yep. Dog, yep. Fish, yep. That's very basic idea of components. We've done stuff with them now, and kind of shown various things. You can use conditions inside a component. So for instance, inside of our button thing, we can actually say, you know what, if it doesn't have a title, let's just replace this with submit, right? So it's like, if it has a title, then we want to print a title, or we just print submit instead. So now back here, if I don't give, say, my third button a title, it will actually just run normal JavaScript, right? This is just you could think of this like I could extract this out and say const title equals that. Same thing, it's the exact same code. Very cool. If you're going to do something like, you can do all this kind of conditional logic all over the place if you'd like to. Yeah, cool stuff. Probably the only other thing is another common programming pattern that you will see is that to avoid props being trickled all throughout the component and taking up a lot of space, you'll actually see quite often that people will destructure the properties right inside of the parameter list. Because as you know, you can actually do this, right? You can say, I actually want the background, the click, and the title from props. Destructuring. And this is handy because now when you're writing your component, you don't need to write props dot all over the place. You can actually just do this because you've defined these variables very clearly there. It's a lot cleaner, it's a lot simpler. And even more, because you're just destructuring props, that common programming pattern I mentioned is to actually destructure it right in the parameter list. So what this is saying here is that this function takes in one parameter that is an object that contains these three properties, and I'd like those three properties from that object. So this is kind of getting to the real crux of what a very simple, straightforward, concise, clean component is in React. You can do a lot with this stuff. You can have buttons keep track of their own state. I think that's one of the next or last things we're going to go through. Actually, we'll kind of talk about that as our last point. So we've just done some examples with prop usage. We've just gone through like a bit of a demo with this. And one important note that's listed here is that all of your React components must act like pure functions. And a pure function is something that doesn't modify the parameters. Basically, your React component should not modify props. Right? If you would like your component to modify something, then what you should do is you should create a use state hook, like welcome, set welcome. Right? This is, you can go check out the use state lectures. Where you do something like this and you say, you know what, the welcome text is going to be that. And if you want your component to update something, then all I'm going to do instead of like passing it a variable to update is I'm just going to say, you know what, when someone clicks cat, I'd actually like a function to be called that calls the set welcome item with a new text, hello, exclamation mark, lots of hello. Right, so follow this through again. We've got a state property in our component. We print out that property, just a welcome message. And then when we've created a function here that when called, this is a function that when called will set the welcome message to hello. We're using that set welcome from the use state hook definition. And that's passed into the component. So that component takes that and it says, you know what, when someone clicks this button, I'm going to execute that function that you gave me. Now you see I click submit, sorry, wrong button, I click cat, and that hello text changed. I'll do it again from like hello with no exclamation marks to hello with that. And you you can complicate these as much as you want to. You can say that, you know, when someone clicks it, I actually want it to say welcome set the welcome to be the current welcome with 2 extra exclamation marks. Bam, 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 bam. You know, there's a lot of very, very powerful things you can do with state management and components and separate files. You can write very intelligent, clean, separated code with very little code, which is, I guess the dream in a lot of ways. So the last thing we're going to go through is talk about the 3 main types of components. You have dumb and stateless components, and these tend to be ones that both don't have use state hooks in them, as in they don't manage their own state, and they don't have any props passed in. They're pretty much just static elements. So they print out, they display the exact same thing all the time. We then have presentational components, which are components that may have props passed in down here, but they don't manage their own state. This is kind of a lot of what we wrote today. We kind of wrote presentational components here. There's no use state hooks in here. They're completely deterministic based on the different kinds of props that they're given. So this is really stupid, just like dumb as hell. This is prop stuff. And then we have container components. And these are typically components that have other components in them. So the example down here is that you might have one component that simply calls another component. And we actually wrote one of those. It's our app.js right at the start. This is a container component. It's a JavaScript component that contains other components inside of it. So quite straightforward. The very last thing that I want to talk about here is children for components, because you might look at this paragraph tag and you might say, you know what, this is really nice, and I could pass in text like this and say, I am a duck. And you could, look at this and you could, get the text and you could put it here and you think, okay, that's a cute component. But I really would like to just use it like I would normally expect to with HTML, because I think that makes more sense, right? I want to do something like this. Well, how do you do that? You can do this. It's perfectly fine. In fact, if you write this, it will still call the component the same. It's the same component as what we had before. It's just that what's passed into it is a bit different. And I'll show you this. So instead of printing out text like that, let's actually just console log props. So let's see what props are. Now props in this first case here, right? We have a look at this first case. Props in this case is simply an object with a text property that says I'm a duck. Whereas in the second case here, you see that props is an object with a property children. And if you ever call a component and you pass in that inner HTML or that inner text here, then React will automatically assign a children property to props. So it's just the name of it. It's called children. So now you can do props.children and you will be able to print that out. So that's how you actually do like that inner HTML stuff. You tend to do that for container elements in particular, right? Usually not so much things that don't kind of have inner components. Because it doesn't have to be text either. You know, you could actually put a button inside of here too. Because it's just the children elements. It's not the inner text, it's the children. So if I run this now, you can see that inside of my paragraph here, I not only have some I am a duck, but I also have a button. And this is all contained inside of that paragraph tag that I've written right here. Yeah, so that's how you deal with children in this case. That pretty much sums up all of the container and prop stuff. That should hopefully start to give you a much stronger indicator of the breadth of things you can do with React as you want to build more and more complicated apps. So thank you very much.